Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about changing code. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what if I don't understand the code well enough to change it? What should I do? Well, I would suggest that if at all possible, you should get an introduction to the code by a coworker who might know how it works. That's probably the first and best thing that you can do. Asking for help and having coworkers is a great thing. And if you can find a place of work where you can do something like this, it's definitely the first stop. Uh, Assuming now, of course, because it's also very important that we respect other people's time, that you have tried your best to figure out if there's any documentation or anything like that. Because running to your coworkers for every little thing is not a good habit to get into. You should absolutely try first and foremost to understand what's going on and so forth. But let's say for the sake of argument that you've been trying to find documentation. Let's say that you've asked your coworkers, or you may not have coworkers, or let's say that the coworker doesn't really know how to solve it. If well, ideally the coworker could just rubber duck with you a little bit, and together you might solve it. But let's just say that you're kind of stuck. You don't really know what to do. Well, what I like to do, this is just my own practice or tip that I can give, is to try to simplify the problem to understand it first and foremost. What I mean by that is basically that if you're dealing with something, a bigger task, something that you're going to have to do, try to create a micro experiment to figure out the parts that make up that problem. So, as an example, let's take something fairly simple. Let's say that you want to understand how to build a like you have a big React page or like an SPA, it doesn't matter if it's Angular, like a front end project, right? And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the page that you're going to do a modification to is really complicated and you don't really understand how it works. Well, the first thing I would do would be to say add a small element in the code to see if I can get that thing to the page. Because if the thing I'm trying to do doesn't really work, well, then I don't really understand it. And I need to do a little experiment to just see, okay, it's like, for me, it's like poking, it's like having a stick and just poking at the problem, see what happens. Okay, so add a console log or something, like just see what the parameters are that's coming into the page, like the props or whatever, and see, okay, what am I getting in? Okay, and then let's backtrack that and let's follow those threads and see, okay, so these pieces of information are relevant to my problem that I'm working on, and let's just see where these values are coming from, and then you start doing a little bit of an investigation, if that makes sense. And you continue that process, like logging things out, adding small differences here and there, just to see if you can observe a pattern in behavior. And then you get, like, my mental picture is that I get a pinch of different threads that may lead me to understanding how this thing works, and then I start pulling on the threads and following them until I get to the next thing, and then I kind of and then it kind of goes from there. And by doing by through that process, I find that most of the time I can understand small pieces little by little, and before you know it, you kind of understand all that, because that's usually what code is. It's when you're dealing with a big problem, the big problem can always be sliced down, usually into smaller pieces, and if you can understand how each individual piece sort of works, it becomes much easier for you to understand the whole, if that makes sense. So what I want you to take away from this is that, at least from my perspective, if you're dealing with code that you don't understand well enough to change it, the first thing that you should always try to do is to find documentation or anything that kind of explains how this thing is supposed to be working. You can uh, look around in the code and see if somebody has given you some reference code or whatever, right? Second thing might be that you go and talk to coworkers or stakeholders. Maybe you have a business person who doesn't know how the code works but knows how the feature works, and then you might be able to get some leads on how the thing is supposed to work. Ideally, if you have coworkers, you should talk to them and get an introduction. That's also a very good thing. That's like the best thing. Even if the coworker doesn't really know how to solve the problem. Maybe you can rubber duck a little bit and see if you can work together to solve the problem. And lastly, if you're really stuck and you've tried everything else, like trying to search for things on the internet and so forth, then starting to make your own small experiments in the area of the code is something that I find to be very helpful. Everything from just logging stuff out and like adding statements to see where do I, or using a debugger to step through the code and see how is the execution actually going, to try to just experiment a little bit with small micro experiments in that area of the code, and as I like to say, poke the problem with a stick and just see how it reacts until you start seeing a pattern in these reactions. And then from that you're going to get learnings, small threads like I like to call it, and follow those threads and see how all these pieces that make up the entire system are fitting together in this context. And usually that's the thing, at least for me, that makes it all make sense. Have a great day.